Let me ask you something. When was the last time a country had 5 separate mysterious explosions in a single week, and every single time, the government's official explanation was either a gas leak, a picnic gas cylinder, or complete silence? That is exactly what is happening right now inside the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the mainstream media, the same liberal establishment networks that you have been watching for years, are not showing you any of this. They are sitting there in their studios painting a picture of a unified, victorious Islamic Republic that has somehow brought America to its knees. That is not what is happening. That is the complete opposite of what is actually happening on the ground in Tehran tonight. So let us get into it, because what we are seeing right now in Iran is not just a military story, it is not just a diplomatic story. What we are watching unfold in real time is the beginning of a historic internal collapse inside one of the most dangerous regimes on the planet, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRG, the organization that runs Iran's proxy network stretching from Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq, is tearing itself apart from the inside, and the explosions that have been rocking Tehran, that have been shaking Bandar Abbas near the Strait of Hormuz, those explosions are just the sound of that collapse echoing across the region. Here is what you need to understand before we go any further. A ceasefire extension deal was announced between the United States and Iran. A 60-day window was declared. The idea, at least from Washington's perspective, was to give the two sides enough time to negotiate something real, something meaningful, specifically around Iran's nuclear program. President Trump has been absolutely clear about what he wants. He wants the nuclear program dismantled. He wants the IRG to stop behaving like a terrorist organization. He wants the Strait of Hormuz open for international shipping without any interference from Iranian speedboats firing warning shots at vessels. That is what America wants from this deal. Now here is where it gets fascinating and also deeply dangerous. The moment that ceasefire extension was announced, something unexpected happened inside Iran. The hardline faction of the IRG did not celebrate. They did not shake hands and say well done. They went to the streets in rage. They marched to the foreign ministry in the middle of the night. They set fire to American and Israeli flags. Basij militia members, the volunteer paramilitary force controlled by the IRG, physically marched to the foreign ministry building in Tehran to protest the very decision their own government had just made. Think about that for a moment. The enforcers of the Islamic Republic, the men who have spent decades beating protesters, arresting journalists, and cracking down on any form of dissent inside Iran, those very same men are now the ones protesting in the streets against their own leadership. And the chants are not subtle. In Tehran Zengalab Square, demonstrators were recorded chanting specific phrases targeting Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi. They were calling him a dishonorable compromiser. They were calling him an infiltrator. In Mashhad, Iran's second largest city, crowds gathered outside the foreign ministries, diplomatic building chanting death to Araghchi, not resign, not step down, death. These are IRG-affiliated crowds saying death to their own foreign minister because he dared to negotiate with America. The Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who was actually one of Iran's lead negotiators in the talks with the United States, he is now also being targeted. Protesters are calling him a traitor. The very man who sat across the table from American officials and tried to negotiate a deal is now being threatened by his own supporters. Meanwhile, in Tehran and near Bandar Abbas, a critical port city that sits right at the edge of the Strait of Hormuz, multiple explosions have occurred. 3 loud blasts were reported near Bandar Abbas in the early morning hours. The Iranian state semi-official Fars news agency, which has direct links to the IRG, confirmed the sounds of the explosions but said the exact location and source were unknown. That is what they say publicly. A few hours earlier, in Tajish Square in Tehran, another explosion was recorded on video, bright orange flames rising into the dark sky. The regime's official explanation this time was a picnic gas cylinder. A picnic gas cylinder caused that explosion, not a weapons depot, not a targeted strike, a picnic gas cylinder. Now you can believe that explanation if you want to, but when you look at the pattern, when you look at the history of what has been happening inside Iran over the last several months, there is a consistent trend. An explosion happens, the regime says gas leak or gas cylinder, and then a few weeks later, quietly, with no announcement, the Islamic Republic state media mentions in passing that another senior IRG commander has been killed. Oh, we lost a commander. How did that happen? He just died, mysteriously, in a location that happened to be near a recent explosion. This is the state of Iran in 2026, a regime that cannot protect its own commanders, a regime that cannot explain its own explosions, a regime so divided against itself that the hardliners are marching through the capital at night to protest the diplomatic decisions of their own government. And above all of this, above all, The chaos and the explosions and the infighting, there are 90 million Iranian people being held hostage by this collapsing machine. The mainstream media will not show you this. They will tell you Iran is united. They will tell you Iran won. They will tell you Trump blinked, but you are here, and that means you want the truth. So let us keep going because it gets much more complicated. Let us talk about this so-called deal because there is an enormous amount of confusion about what was actually agreed upon, and a significant amount of that confusion was manufactured, either deliberately by the Iranian side to tell their own population they won, or accidentally by media outlets that reported on the announcement without understanding what they were actually reporting. Here is the foundation of what happened. After weeks of brutal conflict, after American airstrikes, Iranian ballistic missiles, Strait of Hormuz blockades, and a military confrontation that threatened to drag the entire Gulf region into open war, the United States and Iran agreed to a memorandum of understanding, ANMU, not a peace. A treaty, not a final deal, not a surrender document from either side, a memorandum of understanding, which is essentially an agreement to continue talking, with a ceasefire extension providing the space for those further negotiations to take place. President Trump publicly stated what America expects from the final deal. He wants Iran's nuclear program dismantled. He wants the ballistic missile development curtailed. He wants the proxy network, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, the militias in Iraq. He wants all of those operations defunded and dismantled. In return, the United States has offered a significant sanctions relief package, according to Iran's state-affiliated Mer News, which published what it described as details of a 14-point draft memorandum. The deal contemplates the release of frozen Iranian assets valued at $24 billion. The Americans would lift specific sanctions in stages, conditional on Iranian compliance. But here is what Vice President Ghalibaf had to clarify publicly, because Iranian propaganda immediately went into overdrive the moment the ceasefire was announced. Iran's state television, within hours of the announcement, declared that the Americans had surrendered. They said the United States had agreed to withdraw its forces from the region. They said Iran would receive all of its frozen assets immediately. They said the Strait of Hormuz would return to Iranian management. They said Trump had come to Iran on his knees. Every single one of those claims was false. Ghalibaf came out publicly and stated unambiguously that not a single dollar of frozen assets or sanctions relief has been sent to Iran, not from the United States, not from any of America's allies in the Gulf, $0, nothing has been transferred, the deal is conditional, Iran only gets the benefits if Iran fulfills the obligations. And the obligations are enormous. Iran has to actually dismantle its nuclear program. Iran has to actually stop supporting its regional proxies. Iran has to actually allow international verification of its compliance. None of that has happened yet. And the IRG knows it will not happen because the IRG has already told its own people publicly that it will not happen. This is where the story becomes almost absurd. The IRG's own spokesmen and commanders have been giving public statements on camera saying the war with America is not over. The mayor of Tehran, Ali Reza Zakhani, who is an IRG-aligned figure, said on camera that their war with America is an existential war that does not end with any memorandum of understanding. The commander of the Katamia headquarters, Ali Abdullahi, said they are waiting for the slightest mistake by the enemy to deliver an unforgettable and decisive response. The head of the IRG's Quds Force, Ismail Khani, who had been in hiding for an extended period before suddenly reappearing, said that Hezbollah performed very strongly in the recent war, that Hamas will be rebuilt, and that the axis of resistance showed power in the recent conflict. These are not the statements of an organization that believes the war is over. These are the statements of an organization that is using the ceasefire as a temporary pause to regroup, rearm, and prepare for the next phase of whatever comes after the 60 days are up. Now, why did Trump agree to this 60-day window if the IRG is already publicly announcing it has no intention of honoring the spirit of the deal? The answer is actually quite straightforward from a geopolitical standpoint. Trump needed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The blockade of the strait, which at its peak was causing international shipping to virtually halt through a waterway that carries approximately 20% of the world's oil supply, was having a devastating impact on global markets. Oil prices were spiking, supply chains were being disrupted, the American economy was feeling pressure. Trump had to get ships moving through the strait again, and the ceasefire extension accomplished that immediately. From the American perspective, the calculus was simple. Trade a 60-day pause in active military operations for the reopening of a critical global waterway, stabilize markets, and use those 60 days to figure out the next move from the Iranian perspective, or at least from the propaganda version they are selling to their own people. They got America to stop bombing them, and they did not give up anything substantive. The nuclear program is still intact. The missile program is still intact. The proxies are still operational in the regime's telling. Iran won. But here is what the regime is not telling its own people. Their nuclear facilities have been damaged in the strikes. Their senior nuclear scientists have been systematically eliminated. Their air defense systems were penetrated repeatedly. The Strait of Hormuz, which they used as their biggest leverage point, can be closed by them. Again, yes, but it can also be responded to with overwhelming American naval force again. The economic cost of another strait closure would fall on Iran as much as on the rest of the world. The internal split inside the IRG reflects this reality. The pragmatists know Iran cannot sustain another round of airstrikes. The hardliners believe any deal is surrender, and caught between those two positions is a regime that is publicly promising victory while privately calculating how much more punishment it can absorb before something breaks permanently. What we are watching inside Iran right now is not just political disagreement. Political disagreement is normal. Political disagreement is what happens in functioning governments when people have different opinions about policy. What we are watching inside the Islamic Republic of Iran is something categorically different. We are watching an ideological organization that has defined itself entirely around the concept of resistance against America, suddenly being asked by its own leadership to shake hands with America and make a deal, and the result is a system that is psychologically and institutionally incapable of processing that instruction. Think about what the IRG actually is at its core. It is not just a military organization, it is a revolutionary organization. It was built on a single founding premise that America is the great Satan, that Israel must be destroyed, that the Islamic Revolution must be exported across the Muslim world, and that any compromise with the enemy is treason. For 47 years, every IRG recruit has been indoctrinated with that worldview from the moment they join. Every commander has built their career on that ideology. Every general has justified every decision, every atrocity, every assassination, every proxy war by pointing to that founding revolutionary principle. We are fighting the enemy. We do not negotiate with the enemy. And now their own government is negotiating with the enemy. The hardline faction is not a small minority. Sources speaking to major international outlets have described a significant portion of IRG leadership as deeply opposed to any deal with Washington. There have even been discussions among opposition figures and analysts monitoring the situation inside Iran about the possibility of hardliners attempting a military coup if the deal process moves forward in a way they consider unacceptable. That is not a rumor that is being discussed openly by people with direct knowledge of conversations happening inside Iran. The protests in Tehran and Mashhad are being led by Basij members and IRG-affiliated figures, not by ordinary Iranian citizens who oppose the regime. The ordinary Iranian people have their own complex feelings about this deal, many of them hoping that any kind of agreement means less bombing and more economic normalcy, but the people marching to the foreign ministry at 2 in the morning and chanting for the execution of their own foreign minister, those are regime insiders, those are the true believers, those are the people who built their entire identity around the idea that Iran never surrenders. And critically, the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the assassinated Ali Khamenei, has not been seen publicly since being named as his father's successor. This absence is being interpreted in different ways by different analysts. Some believe he is consolidating power quietly, trying to manage the hardliner faction without publicly antagonizing them. Others believe there is genuine uncertainty about who is actually making decisions inside the regime right now. The hardline banner that was erected at a major Tehran intersection declaring that the Strait of Hormuz will remain closed, that banner was attributed to Mojtaba Khamenei's authority, but then the strait was reopened as part of the ceasefire, so either Mojtaba Khamenei changed his position or someone made that decision without his full endorsement, or the banner was put up by hardliners acting on an assumption that was then overruled. Any of those three explanations is deeply concerning for the stability of the regime. What makes all of this even more volatile is the new nuclear leadership question. Senior Iranian nuclear scientists have been assassinated over the course of this conflict. Nuclear facilities have been damaged. The scientific and technical capacity of the nuclear program has taken serious hits. The regime used to be able to tell its hardliner base that the nuclear program was their ultimate insurance policy, the thing that guaranteed no one could ever truly defeat Iran. Now that insurance policy has holes in it, and the hardliners who believed in that guarantee are furious. There is also the question of what happens when the 60 days expire. Inside the IRG, the current thinking among the hardline faction appears to be that they will use the ceasefire window to rebuild, rearm, and then simply refuse to comply with whatever the Americans want from the final agreement. Their calculation is that by the End of 60 days, they will have rebuilt enough of their capabilities that they can threaten a new Strait of Hormuz blockade as leverage to extract better terms, or they will simply walk away from the deal and dare Trump to start bombing again. This is an organization that does not think the way normal diplomatic actors think. The IRG's top commanders, Ismail Qani, Ali Reza Zaghani, Ali Abdullahi and others, have all made statements in recent days that are not the statements of men preparing to sign a peace agreement. They are the statements of men preparing for the next round. They are telling their own people not to mourn, not to surrender, not to accept that the war is over, because in their minds it is not over, it is simply paused. The explosions happening in Tehran and near Bandar Abbas exist within this context, whether they are the result of American or Israeli covert operations, internal sabotage by factions within the regime, or accidents resulting from the general deterioration of Iranian infrastructure under the pressure of war and sanctions. The effect is the same. The regime cannot protect itself from explosions inside its own capital, and in a system built entirely on the projection of strength, that inability to project strength internally is existential. If anyone needed proof that the ceasefire extension between Iran and the United States is not functioning the way it was advertised to the world, they got that proof within hours of the announcement, because Hezbollah, the Iranian proxy organization that operates out of Lebanon and has been designated as a terrorist organization by the United States and numerous other countries, launched an attack on Israeli territory within literally one day of the ceasefire being announced. Let us be very specific about what happened. A Hezbollah drone crossed into northern Israel and targeted the area around Kiryat Shmona, a city in northern Israel that has been one of the primary targets of cross-border attacks throughout this conflict. The Israeli Iron Dome air defense system activated and intercepted the threat. No major casualties were reported from that specific incident, but the significance of that attack is not measured in the damage it caused. The significance is in what it tells us about how Hezbollah views this ceasefire. Hezbollah's leader Naim Qassem publicly rejected the latest ceasefire framework between Israel and Lebanon. He stated that any demand for Hezbollah's fighters to leave southern Lebanon while under attack would amount to surrender and defeat. Hezbollah then carried out approximately 20 separate attacks on Israeli forces in southern Lebanon in a single day, according to the group's own Telegram channels. Anti-tank missiles, mortar fire, drone strikes, all directed at Israeli Defense Forces positions in the border area. The IDF responded with counterstrikes, killing a number of Hezbollah fighters who had approached Israeli ground troops in southern Lebanon. And here is the critical context that most mainstream media reports have failed to adequately explain. Hezbollah does not make these decisions independently. Hezbollah's strategic direction comes from Tehran, specifically from the IRGC Quds Force, which is the unit responsible for managing, funding, training, and directing all of Iran's proxy organizations across the region. When Ismail Qani, the Quds Force commander who had been hiding for months, suddenly reappears and publicly declares that Hezbollah performed very strongly and that Hamas will be rebuilt and that the axis of resistance showed power, that is not an old general reminiscing about past battles. That is a current commander sending instructions to his proxy organizations. The message is clear: do not stand down, do not accept the ceasefire as the end, keep fighting, keep testing, keep probing. The Lebanese parliament speaker Nabi Berri, who is a Hezbollah ally, offered a conditional statement suggesting that Hezbollah might be willing to withdraw from areas south of the Litani River if Israel also pulls out and a comprehensive ceasefire is reached. But Hezbollah's own military wing rejected the ceasefire terms that had been reached between the Lebanese government and Israel, and hours after Lebanon and Israel announced a ceasefire framework in Washington, Israel launched fresh strikes into Lebanon anyway, further complicating any effort to stabilize the situation. The dynamic here is painfully familiar to anyone who has been paying attention to this region for more than a week. You have a ceasefire announced at the political level, and then you have the actual armed factions on the ground continuing to fight, either because they reject the political decision or because they are being instructed to keep fighting by handlers who want to maintain pressure without triggering a full return to war. The IRG is very good at this game. They have been playing it for decades. You use your proxies to poke, probe, and provoke while maintaining plausible deniability at the state level. Tehran can say we agreed to the ceasefire. Hezbollah is a separate organization. We cannot control what they do. And meanwhile, Hezbollah is doing exactly what Tehran wants it to do. For Israel, this situation is intolerable. Israel's absolute red line has never been about the ceasefire paperwork. Israel's red line is the continued existence of armed Hezbollah forces near its northern border with the capability to launch rockets, drones, anti-tank missiles, and cross-border raids at will, the disarmament of Hezbollah. or at minimum its withdrawal north of the Litani River, is something Israel has been demanding since the 2006 Lebanon war. 20 years later, Hezbollah is still there, still armed, still fighting, and now, even in the middle of a ceasefire, still attacking. The Iron Dome intercepted the drone, Israeli forces killed Hezbollah fighters who approached their positions, but every interception, every counterattack, every tit-for-tat exchange raises the probability of an incident that escalates beyond what anyone can control. One Israeli soldier killed by a Hezbollah missile, one Hezbollah commander eliminated by an Israeli strike that also kills civilians, one miscalculation by either side, and the 60-day ceasefire window collapses entirely, dragging the entire region back into full-scale conflict. The Americans are aware of this risk, which is why the White House has been focused on preventing exactly this kind of escalation. Trump publicly warned both Israel and Iran not to, in his words, blow it. The message from Washington is to hold steady, give the 60 days a chance to produce something, and do not let Hezbollah's provocations or Israel's responses derail the broader process. But telling Israel not to respond to Hezbollah attacks while Hezbollah continues to fire rockets at Israeli territory is an extraordinarily difficult task of a government that has built its entire political legitimacy on the premise of zero tolerance for attacks on Israeli citizens. Everything we have discussed so far, the explosions in Tehran, the Irgun fighting, the Hezbollah attacks, the propaganda war over the meaning of the mu, all of it is prologue. The real question, the question that will define the next chapter of this conflict, is what happens when the 60-day clock runs out, and rather than speculate wildly, let us actually think through the three realistic scenarios that could unfold, because they are very different from each other and the differences matter enormously. The first scenario is what we might call the bad deal scenario. In this scenario, Iran uses the 60 days to rebuild its damaged capabilities. The nuclear facilities that were hit get repaired as much as possible. The proxy organizations receive new funding and new weapons. And at the end of 60 days, the IRG comes back to the table with maximalist demands that they know the Americans cannot accept. They will demand the full withdrawal of American military forces from the region. They will demand sanctions lifted before any verification of nuclear compliance. They will demand that Hezbollah's right to operate in Lebanon be written into any agreement. They will use the threat of another Strait of Hormuz blockade as leverage to extract concessions. And the question then becomes whether the White House, under political and economic pressure, whether Trump accepts something that looks like a deal but is actually a humiliation. If that happens, if the final agreement allows Iran to maintain its nuclear infrastructure, keep its proxy network, and receive sanctions relief without genuine verification, then the regime wins, not because they defeated America militarily, because they did not, but because they outlasted American resolve. That is the scenario that people tracking this situation find most concerning. The second scenario is what we might call the return to conflict scenario. In this version, Iran's hardliners successfully sabotage the negotiating process. The 60 days end without any agreement. The IRG closes the Strait of Hormuz again. Trump, who has been very explicit about not wanting to appear weak, orders a resumption of military operations, and we are back to bombing, missiles, and regional escalation, except this time with even more uncertainty about where it leads because Iran's proxy network has had 60 days to reposition and rearm. This scenario also has a domestic American political dimension that cannot be ignored. Going back to war after declaring a ceasefire is politically complicated for any president. It requires explaining to the American public why the deal failed, who is to blame, and what the new strategy is. Trump's strength in foreign policy has always been his ability to frame situations in terms of win or lose. A return to conflict would need to be framed very carefully as Iran's fault for violating the deal, as proof that the IRG cannot be trusted, as a necessary response rather than a choice. Whether Trump can successfully make that argument to the American public while also managing the economic consequences of a new strait blockade is genuinely uncertain. The third scenario is the one that almost no one believes is likely, but that would change the region more than anything else. This is the good deal scenario. In this version, the 60 days actually produce a genuine agreement. Iran agrees to international verification of its nuclear program. The IRG accepts real constraints on its proxy network. The Strait of Hormuz remains open under a framework that does not require Iranian speedboats to be threatening ships every other week, and in exchange, Iran gets meaningful sanctions relief that allows the Iranian economy to breathe again after decades of crushing economic pressure. The reason almost no one believes this scenario is possible is because of the internal IRG dynamics we have already discussed. How does any Iranian negotiator sign a document that the hardline faction of the IRG will interpret as surrender? How does the new supreme leader Mojtaba Khamenei, who is already absent from public view and managing an extraordinarily difficult internal political situation, how does he sell genuine compromise to men who are marching through Tehran at 2 in the morning demanding that the foreign minister be executed? The honest answer is that no one inside or outside Iran knows the answer to that question right now. The regime is at its weakest point in its history, weaker than during the Green Movement protests of 2009, weaker than during the Mahsa Amini protests of 2022 and 2023, those previous moments of weakness were always managed by the IRG stepping in as the enforcer, the iron fist that crushed dissent and restored regime control. But this time, the IRG itself is the divided institution, the enforcer is divided against itself, and when the organization that is supposed to prevent the system from falling apart is itself falling apart, the calculations become genuinely unpredictable. What we can say with confidence is this: the 60-day clock has started. Every day that passes without a genuine breakthrough makes the bad deal scenario or the return to conflict scenario more likely. The IRG hardliners are not staying quiet. They are actively working to undermine the negotiating process. The explosions inside Iran are not stopping. Hezbollah is not standing down. And at the end of all of this, Trump and his team at the White House are going to have to make a decision about what kind of deal, if any, is actually acceptable. The Strait of Hormuz has been reopened for now, oil is flowing, markets have calmed slightly, but the fundamental problem, an Iranian regime that has built its entire identity around refusing to comply with American demands, that problem has not been solved. The 60 days are buying time, not buying solutions, and when the time runs out, everything we have been watching, the explosions, the protests, the Hezbollah attacks, the IRG infighting, all of it is going to matter enormously in determining what comes next. Stay here, because this story is not even close to over. We are in the middle of it right now, and the next 60 days are going to be some of the most consequential days in the history of the Middle East.